G'day trendsetters, Greg here from Fish Play Films, and we're out on a beautiful winter's day here in Brisbane, Australia. It's a lovely day, so I thought I'd film this outside rather than inside. So end of winter, so it's nice and warm without being too hot, and the skies are nice and clear. Now, as the Bishop said to the actress, I love a good set of curves, and so do I, trendsetters, and especially on your model railroad. And I know that getting curves right is a big thing, and it makes a huge difference to how your trains look and run on your layout. Now, one of the things that makes curves even better, it's one of those little secret things that you don't sort of notice it, is a transition curve. And I've mentioned this before on some of my track laying videos. And today I thought we'd go through and we'd make a template on transition curves so you can lay them quick and easy and draw them out easy on your layout without having to go to all too much trouble. Now, transition curve, it's quite easy. Instead of the curve going along and going straight in, or sorry, the straight going along, going into a curve like a set track, the curve, as it says, the straight transitions into the curve. So it starts off at a broader radius and gradually increases or decreases in radius till it gets to the radius of the whole curve. Sounds complicated, but it's not really. Flexible track, it's really easy to lay a transition curve with flexible track because it sort of transitions itself. If you just get the track down and you just sort of pull it slowly round the curve, it'll ease into the curve pretty much by itself. But to get that right and to get it consistent is the way, and I've seen a lot of track on layouts, even with broad curves, that don't have a transition, and people tend to spike them on the straight right up to the end and then pull them into the curve, and it just looks, even on a broad curve, it looks bad. And you can have a tighter radius curve with a transition that your trains will look much better going into than a broader curve without one. So let's we'll get in a bit closer here and we'll explain how transition is and what it is and how it is to make one really easy for your layout. Now, I guess the first thing to remember is that your transition is going to take up a little bit more room widthwise than you normally would. So here is our curve coming around here. I think this is a 30-inch radius. I just drew it out from one of my arcs that I have on a bit of timber. And normally, your track would come around here and just go straight onto the straight along there like that. Now, what I did on the Birdwood sub trendsetters, I sort of cheated a little bit because I, didn't follow the 6 Ps exactly. But what I did, I come along with my track on the straight using the same center line as the curve, and what I tried to do, and I sort of got away with it a little bit, but what I tried to do was ease the curve in. So what you would normally do, instead of there's a straight there, there's a curve, instead of starting to bend the track round like that, with an easement or a transition, you would start bending the track back here a little bit further, away from where the center line of the curve is, or the center line, where the radius comes out. So that's where your straight finishes, that's where your curve starts. You start bending the track back here somewhere, ever so slightly. So what I was trying to do, with keeping the center lines in line and not having the straight section track out wider, I was trying to cheat. So yes, I was starting this nice slow transition. So that's fine, and it's quite easy. Once you get with nice flex track, you can lay a transition curve really easily. The thing about having a template to do it, which I'll show you how to make, is that you can get them consistent. And what I was doing was I'm getting this nice curve in here. It's starting back here somewhere, and it's gradually coming around. I'm getting a nice real curve. That's nice. But I'm going wider because your transition, the radius of your transition is wider than the radius of your normal curve. So I was sort of getting to out here, and then I'd have to sort of bring it in tighter to get back to where I was originally going. So while my curves may look good, trendsetters, and a lot of you do comment on my track work, there are some cases where I had to sort of cheat because I did it wrongly. And what I should have done was been starting the track out here, like that. Then you start back here, and you can start your transition. You've got this nice broad curve around here, and by the time you get sharper, you've caught up to the actual curve. And even I can just even on here looking at this, that's much nicer. So how do we get this so we can get it easy to install on the layout. Well, we will show you. Okay, we've got a little bit of a guide here, and this basically says what radiuses you're using, the offset, which is this bit here, how wide your straight is, how broader your straight is. So just remember that your straights are always wider than your curves. So let's say here, for example, a 30-inch radius curve, we've got a 10 to 12 millimeter offset, which is about ½ an inch. So that's how big the gap is from your straight track to where your curve is. So normally your curved track would come through and go onto the straight here. This is our offset. So your track is out here somewhere. Whoops, and we go upside down here. Where are we? Now, this is our transition length. So for a 30-inch radius curve, we've got our 10 to 12 mil or ½ inch offset. This is our transition length. So it's about 20 inches or 500 mil. Now, what is that trendsetters? Our transition, that 500 mil or 20 inches, is from the curve to the straight. And the center of that is where your radius comes up and matches with your straight here. So if you were to draw a line from here down to the center of your curve where you put your arc or your protractor or whatever, and you brought that up from the center of your curve, that there is the middle of your transition. So, I didn't draw it in on this one, but let's just have a guesstimate. That's probably about 250 mil there, and we'll go. Now look, this isn't exact. You can massage these figures, trendsetters. You can massage them to what you like. But the biggest thing is that your straight is out broader than your curves. Now, why I keep saying that is, we'll get into how we put this on bench work in a minute, but we've got our marks here. That's our transition length from here to here. This is the center of our transition, which in this case is 250 mil. So when you're laying your track, you come along and you spike your track or glue it or whatever you want to do. And I'm using the center line. That's why I love using Midwest cork, because you can put a center line down and then you can lay the cork just like you're laying the track on the center line. And then when you can lay your track on the cork, as long as you keep the same spacing from the edge of the cork, you get pretty good at it. It's so easy, and I really enjoy doing it. So for me, I work on center lines. If you work on edges, well, then you'll have to adjust this, but the measurements are basically the same. But I'm working on a center line. So let's go here. We're going along here. We'll spike our track to here. Then I would just let it go and follow it round. And I know for a fact that I've started on my transition here on this line, and then by the time I get to this other line, the end of our transition, I need to be on the center line of the track here. And by the time I've got to the center line there, then I can just follow the curve around with my normal scribed center line. Now, how do we get this bit good in here? Okay, we shall show you how to get that bit. So when you cut your template out, that's going to be pretty well perfect every time. Okay, you need to get something that's springy and still reasonably stiff, that's not going to kink when you do it. This stuff is, we call it yellow tongue down here. It's the plastic that's in between ply flooring. You buy sheets of ply flooring. This is like the tongue and groove wire flooring. It's really good stuff. Electricians, we used to use it all the time, wiring houses for fishing cables down walls and stuff like that. It's quite very strong and quite flexible, but not too flexible. It gets a nice spring in it when you curve it. So the idea is, this is to draw our nice transition line. I'm just using some blocks here because I'm not going to actually make one, but when you're going to make one, you would pin this for about a foot straight, and then around about where your transition starts. Remember, this one is a 500 millimeter or 20-inch transition. So we go in the middle of that. That's where our radius comes up for the curve starts. That's the middle of our transition. So we go 250 mil each side of that. So we've pinned up to the 250 mil here, and then we go around and it bends really nicely. And we follow we let it just sit there and bend in by itself. And you see it's starting to curve there nicely. Now, and then when we get to the other end of our transition, this is the other end. This is our other end of the 250, or our 20 inches. So we've gone 10 inches to the center, and then we've gone 10 inches along the straight. When we get to our mark here, we should be touching the original tighter curve, which is our original curve. And then you would pin this yellow tongue or whatever. You'd follow the original curve round about another foot, and that will get you, so when you're using this template on the layout, you can line this curve up with your proper curve, and then you will line up, you leave say a foot of straight on here, and you'd line that straight up with your straight, and that's your template. So let's just get this on here. Now this yellow tongue has been rolled up, so it's not curving as nicely as it should. It's got a bit of a thingo in it there, but that's okay. It's still pretty nice. So we'll just draw that in there. Okay, let's just say I've pinned that. This is the start of our transition here. So we'll draw that in. Go around to there. Okay. Now I'm using the center line for my template. If you were drawing your track out, say the width of your track, well then this would be the outside of your track. Or if you're doing it for the inside, it would be the inside. Or if you were doing a whole wide piece to put down the whole track, well then you'd have to do another line out here, the width of your track. Or however, how wide you wanted to do it. But this is my center line, so I love working with center lines, and that way you can lay one piece of cork to the center line, the other one you just push up against it. It's easy peasy. So we'll get a close up now and we'll show you this transition in here, and that's it done. And then we'll have a look at why I sort of had to cheat on the Birdwood sub trend setters. Right. Okay, so here's our nice transition. We've started from here. Now if I was marking this as a template, I would carry on for about another foot here, and then this is the start of our transition, and you can see the line coming in nicely here. It's just starting to curve in, getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and this is where it meets our radius that we're using right there. So between there and there is our transition, and that's where we put the yellow tongue or whatever you want to call it. You can use maybe a bit of spring wire or something, whatever you think. And then that's our transition in there. But make sure that it's pinned nice and straight this way, and then you follow the curve past this transition at least a foot that way with whatever spring thing you're using, so it's married in nicely to your proper curve. Now trendsetters, this is where I went wrong when I was doing my bench work for the Birdwood sub. So if you're planning a layout now and looking at, or doing an extension or doing some new track work, this is where you need to sort of put a bit of thought in for your transition curves. So in the old days, if we weren't doing a transition curve, you would come along here, and let's say this is your center line for your track, and away you'd go. You'd follow that around there. And with me, I like to be pretty neat with my bench work, at least the outer edges anyway. So let's say this is the outer edge. So this is the, oops, there we go. This is the outer edge of our ply, and I want this nice and flush with here. So that's all very nice. But of course, this is your curve coming around here, the original curve. But your transition, remember our straight here, we need an offset. So our center line's going to be out here somewhere. So your track's going to end up right on this edge. And so I didn't want that. So I was coming along here with a center line, and my track was here. So I was trying to get a smooth transition in, and it would end up out here somewhere, and then I'd have to sort of go tighter, like I mentioned before, to get back in. So you've got two options. You know that your straight, we've said to you before, the straight sections have to be wider than your curve. So you can either sort of, do something like this. Of course, this bit will be wider. So you could do something like that, so your straight can come along, and then as the transition going and get tighter, then it can meet up with that curve there. That looks a bit yucky. So what I think is the better way to do it is to make your curved piece of ply, let's say 15 mil or an inch wider, and your track will be set back in towards there. So initially when your track's coming round, it will be in the middle around here somewhere, and then as the transition comes out, the curve will widen and go onto your straight here. So as it comes in around the curve, it will get tighter and move away from the outside here, rather than come around if it was like that. Oh, sorry, if it was like that, and come around and your curve will be over here somewhere. So that's something to think about, that your straight is going to be about, depending on the transition that you choose, somewhere between, you know, 1/8 of an inch or 1/2 an inch to maybe even an inch if you want, wider on each side of a curve. So if you're doing a 180-degree curve, like we all have to do somewhere, the straight sections of your layout are going to be minimum, let's say, 30 mil, 1.5 inches or so wider than it would be. Which doesn't sound much, but if you're stuck for space or something like that, you know, you need to figure that in. But with your curves, with your bench work, if you want your bench work tight, like nice and flush on the outside here, remember that your curves are going to go in and get tighter on the curves here, because your original curve will come up and then it will get wider as it comes out to the transition out here. Clear as mud, trendsetters? Okay, we've marked out our template from the outside here all the way around. Now for me, as I said before, I use the center line. So if I was going to make this into a template, I would cut very carefully. Now this is the end of our transition here. I've gone about another 200 mil. You could probably go another 300, you know, make it a foot longer if you wanted to. Remember, this is our proper curve. So if you're using different radiuses throughout the layout, you'll have to make up different templates for each radius. But if you feel confident enough laying your track, you can lay your center line out on a curve and just bring your straight out, you know, another 1/2 inch or whatever. And then as you lay your cork, because the cork lays really nicely too, I must admit, it almost lays like really nice flex track. You can get a transition in pretty well by eye, but the idea is matching this curve here. But as I say, if you do a template, you can just whack this down, you know, draw your center line out on your track, which you would do with either, when you cut your ply out, you would have your center line on that, or however you mark your track. And it's just a simple matter of lining this up on a bit of your curve here and moving this until this lines up with your straight. So you'll have your straight marked up here somewhere, and, you know, Bob's your mother's brother. There you go. But if I was going to cut this out as a template, I'd start, you know, back here a bit further maybe. Come follow this line, a transition around. Remember, that's the start of our transition. This is the center, that's our radius there. This is the other half of our transition here. Then I'd go along about another 200 or 300 for a straight. And then I'd just do a rough cut down here, as I've done here. And I've marked this left, so this is a left-hand curve. If you wanted a right-hand curve, you'd have to make a right-hand version. If you were making this, though, the width of your track, let's say you were laying, you made this as wide as your cork. Now you could do that too, if you like. You could make this exactly as wide as your cork and cut this out exactly as width of your cork. Then you could just flip this over. I prefer to use the center line myself because the edge of the cork is a little bit raggedy, and I prefer to use the center line. But if you wanted to be even more efficient, you could make this exactly the width of your cork or whatever road bed width you're using, and then you could just left, right, flip this over. But for me, I will be doing, if I need to do one, I'll be doing a left and a right. And you don't even need to have any of these marks on it then, as long as you marry this edge up with your center line of your normal curve and that with your straight, you are done, trendsetters. Now, another thing when you're laying track, when you're using this, one of the secrets in laying good track too is with S-bends. We all love S-curves, but the hard and fast rule of an S-curve is you must have a straight between the two curves as long as your longest piece of rolling stock. That's the minimum requirements. Now, let's say I always used to work on 300 mil or a foot, because an auto rack's about that long. And if you put a foot of straight between your reverse curves, you will never have any problems and it looks a lot better. When you're using an easement, you have to remember that in your planning, because you're losing about, you know, a good 8 to 10 inches on this end, and at the S-bend at the other end, you're going to be losing that. So you're going to go from, say, a minimum of 300, you're probably up to close to 600 mil or a bit more to get your start of your transitions in there. You could probably cheat a little bit and maybe go 100 mil each side of the transition, end of the transition for your straight, and then ease the curves. That'd probably be okay. But even if you did that, you'd still be looking at least, say, 18 inches of straight between an S-curve. So when you're planning a layout, that's another thing to be considerate of too when you're doing easements or transition curves. But it makes a huge difference. Right, well there you have it, trendsetters. Transition curves made easy. Now there's lots written about transition curves. Don't get too caught up about it, but it really is something that you should consider putting in when you're laying track. To say it's easy to lay a transition curve just by bending the flex track around and starting the curve nice and gently. The main thing is, and where I went wrong and tried to fix, you know, and a bit of a cheat, is that you have to remember that your curve is going to be broader. So your straight section of track is going to be wider than where it would normally be. So if you can remember that and just have your straight section out further, you know, even half an inch, and then you can slowly go into your curve and then go into your transition. But with a template like that, you can just line it up with your curve, line it up with your straight, and you know you're going to be perfect every time. And it looks so much better with trains easing themselves into the curve. It won't look like a little Hornby train set screaming round, and your bigger rolling stock will look really good because it eases into the curve. And as I said before, you can have a sharper curve with a nice easement, looks better than a broader curve without an easement. So there you go, or transition. So there you have it. Go and make some templates up, piece of cake, and you've got them there. And when you're planning your layout in the planning stage, make sure that you allow, in my case, say an extra 50 mil of bench width. So if you're doing a let's say 750 radius curve, which is what the birdwood sub is, normally your center lines would be 1500. Well, if you're doing a 180 degree loop, it's going to be 1550 now, because your curve might be 1500, the width of your curve might be 1500, but remember your straights, because the easements are going to take up 15, maybe 15 mil each side, so that's somewhere between an extra 30 mil or 40 mil of bench space that you're going to need in the width, so you don't do that naughty cheating transition curve like I tried to do. Anyway, that'll do. Hope you enjoyed that, and good luck with your track work. Remember, track work is really important, because once you've done scenery and all that sort of thing, it's really hard to fix, and especially these days with lots of people doing cab rides and all that around, the kinks in track work and that can ruin a perfectly good layout that's got great scenery. If you see trains lurching and bouncing and carrying on, it just takes away from all that effort that you've put into the scenery. So there you go. But what can I talk about scenery? I can't talk about scenery. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll catch you again on the Birdwood Sub very soon. Hooroo for now.